On April 1st, 1987, a day that began like any other, a passing motorist drove along the quiet, rural stretch of South Perry Park Road. The wind whispered through the trees, and the gray April sky stretched endlessly overhead. But then, in the curve of the road, something unusual caught his eye. Beside a slight embankment, partially hidden by shrubs and shadows, lay the body of a young woman, 30 years old. Her name, Rhonda Marie Fisher. How could a case like this stay unsolved for nearly 4 decades? South of Sedalia, in Douglas County, Colorado, a place where the loudest sound was often the wind through the pines. That quiet was shattered forever. For decades, her death remained unsolved. No suspect, no definitive clues. Some wondered if the case would ever be solved. Then in 2025, nearly 40 years later, a breakthrough arrived. Modern forensic science, combined with painstaking cold case investigation, finally illuminated the truth. This is her story, the story of a life stolen, of evidence that refused to die quietly, and of science that refused to forget. And what investigators discover next would shock even the most seasoned detectives. The victim was Rhonda Marie Fisher, 30 years old, described by authorities as a mother, daughter, sister, friend. Her last confirmed movements traced back to the Denver area. On the evening before her body was found, she was reportedly seen walking north on Monaco toward Leetsdale, in Denver, roughly 25 miles from the place where she would be discovered. In the weeks prior to her death, investigators say Fisher had been staying with acquaintances. One acquaintance was thoroughly investigated, but eventually cleared. Beyond these bare facts, little has been publicly released about Fisher's personal life, a rare anonymity for case files this old. But consider this. For someone living in a major metro area, moving through streets filled with strangers, the odds of her being watched or followed, unnoticed, no one thought to look there. The few details we have underscore how fragile memory becomes across decades, how small traces can be overlooked, and how easy it is for a life to disappear from public record until someone refuses to forget. Could there have been someone close to her who knew more than anyone realized? On April 1st, 1987, a driver traveling along South Perry Park Road noticed something no one expected. A body lying down a small embankment. That body, Rhonda Marie Fisher, she had been assaulted and strangled. Investigators collected what evidence they could at the time. Among it, paper bags placed over Fisher's hands, a detail that seemed minor then, but would become crucial decades later. Despite leads, acquaintances, friends, even known offenders in Denver, nothing led to a suspect. The trail went cold. Even a DNA test run in 2017 failed to identify anyone. Hold on, nothing led to a suspect. Could evidence have been missed, hidden in plain sight? In early 2025, the cold case file was reopened by the Cold Case Unit of the Douglas County Sheriff's Office. Investigators reevaluated preserved evidence, including those paper bags placed over Fisher's hands nearly 4 decades ago. In October, a case-to-case DNA match was registered by the national database. The trace skin cells, once trapped inside those bags, matched DNA from 3 1979 homicides. And those homicides had already been linked to Vincent Darrell Groves, long considered one of Colorado's most prolific serial killers. The breakthrough was exceptionally rare, as investigators described it, not just for the age of the evidence, but for the precision of the match. Groves had died in custody in 1996. That means he would never stand trial for Fisher's murder. But justice, in a sense, had finally arrived. But here's where it gets worse. 3 decades earlier, could he have been watching her? Could someone have seen him and never realized it? Vincent Darrell Groves was already known to Colorado law enforcement long before 2025. Born April 19, 1954, in Denver, Colorado. It wasn't a detached place. It was his home, and it would be the backdrop of terror for years. Vincent Groves wasn't always known as a killer. In fact, he once looked like an ordinary young man, with his whole future ahead of him. But here's the first twist. He didn't want it anymore. Groves dropped out in 1974 and returned home to Denver, where he moved in with his grandmother and got a job as an electrician. Up to this point, he was nothing special. Just another young man in America trying to find his footing. But the ground beneath him was already shifting. His free time was spent around Denver's red light districts, drinking, drifting, and getting pulled into the underbelly of the city. Places no parent ever wants to imagine their child standing. And it was there, among pimps and vulnerable women, that a darker side began to take shape. By the late 1970s, Groves was spending increasing time on the streets, not just as a bystander, but running with potentially dangerous influences. He was connected with sex trafficking circles, drug distribution rings, and, according to authorities decades later, developed a pattern of violence that targeted the city's most vulnerable women, followed by 23-year-old Joyce Ramey and 20-year-old Peggy Cuff in 1979. These early victims brought fear, but not public infamy. Not yet. Between the late 1970s and 1980s, he was linked to multiple murders targeting vulnerable women. His record shows convictions, but also notable gaps. In 1982, he killed a 17-year-old girl. He served a relatively short prison sentence and walked free by 1987, the same year Fisher was killed. Think about that for a second. A man convicted of killing a child, released early, walking free while the world kept spinning. Once he walked out of prison, Groves moved in with his parents in Denver and took low-profile jobs. But he didn't change. He would kill again. Authorities later described how Groves spent time around Colfax Avenue, a notorious stretch for illicit activity. Prostitution, drugs, nightlife, white noise to most potential opportunities for him. In March 1987, the same year Fisher was killed, Groves assaulted a sex worker named Sheila Washington, beating and attempting to strangle her. She survived, later giving investigators a description of his car. But he wasn't caught. When Groves was finally arrested on September 1st, 1988, it was for a mix of assaults and suspicion around a string of deaths, not yet fully linked to all his suspected murders. In court, they linked him to the 1988 murders of 19-year-old Juanita Lovato and 25-year-old Diane Montoya Mancera, both strangled. Later DNA work confirmed his involvement in older murders. The scale was chilling. Investigators now believe Groves was responsible for at least a dozen homicides, plus an attempted murder and a sexual assault between 1978 and 1988, and possibly more than 20 in total. 3 earlier homicide cases dating to 1979 already carried his DNA profile, enabling investigators decades later to connect the dots when Fisher's preserved evidence was retested. Though Groves passed away in 1996, his DNA legacy spoke. The match to Fisher's case added her name to the grim roster of his victims, closing her file, but expanding a horror that spanned decades. What else could have gone unnoticed in those years? The revelation came nearly 40 years after the murder. By then, Fisher's parents and brother had passed away. The only living close relative known publicly is a cousin, who investigators say was told the truth. For her surviving family, justice may never mean jail time, but answers bring closure. For many victims' families trapped in maybe someday, this case is proof. Someday can be now. In an age of forensic advances, DNA preservation, database cross-referencing, cold case reevaluation, old evidence gains new power. Tools that were science fiction in the 80s are now standard, and justice, once frozen, becomes possible again. Could there still be cases like this, waiting quietly for the right eyes to see them? How many other victims could finally be found if someone dared to look again? The Fisher case underscores 3 truths. Evidence should always be preserved, because decades later, it may crack a case open. Even the smallest trace, a hair, a fiber, a skin cell, can hold the key no one thought to check. Cold cases are not closed until justice is done. And sometimes justice waits for technology to catch up, for fresh eyes to see what others missed. Imagine the files gathering dust, the evidence long forgotten, waiting silently for someone to notice what no one else did. Behind every file number is a life. Decades don't erase human stories. They only bury them deeper. And when someone refuses to let them be forgotten, the story can finally emerge, waiting silently for someone to notice what no one else did. Could a seemingly insignificant detail from the 80s have solved a case decades earlier? This story is a testament to patience, persistence, and the power of science. If you or someone you know has information on a cold case, don't give up hope, because even the oldest evidence may still speak. Imagine it, a decade of violence, young women disappearing, no connections, no answers, until decades later.